This is Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. And this is his scarf. Hungary is painted on the scarf. But if you look at the map, the borders of the country look a little different. And this is Great Hungary. This is how the country used to look like before it lost half of its land and population. To appear in such a scarf in public, for the leader of the state, this is a serious statement. But Viktor Orbán did not do it by accident. His colleagues have the same card in his office. Every Hungarian knows this map. It is printed on postcards, on flags, on monuments, because it is a symbol of the main tragedy in the history of the country. But far from the only one. There are several other events that have shaped Hungary. It is a small, but very unusual and independent state that is ready to defend its interests and views, and wants to become the leader of a new, more conservative Europe. Although the fact that Hungary exists at all in principle is called a miracle, and they say about its history that it is 1,000 years of defeats. And I want to show you how modern Hungary turned out to be built on events from the past. How can historical memory be used to govern the country? Why do all major events in Hungary take place on anniversaries? And how the past can affect not only the present, but even the future. If you've ever been to Hungary, you know one thing for sure about it. There is a very unusual language there. But the paradox is that this incomprehensible language is actually the best way to understand Hungary. Hungarian is spoken by only 14 million people worldwide. It almost doesn't look like anything nearest to it. These are the Uralic languages, Khanty and Mansi. And the fact is that for a very long time, the Hungarians, who call themselves Magyars, came from somewhere in the Urals. It is still not completely clear where exactly. But they settled on the Danube. And now the Hungarians call it the finding of the motherland. For them, this is a very important event, the beginning of the history of the whole nation. But their neighbors call it a little differently, invasion. Because the Magyars did not come peacefully. They plundered, burned, killed, their cavalry demolished everything in their path. They even reached France and Italy. The neighbors were afraid of them. The Magyars were considered such a terrible, wild tribe that brings fear and panic. These nomads on horseback were even confused with the Huns, although they are completely different peoples. But according to one version, even the European name of the country, England, this letter H appeared in the beginning, just because they were considered goons. That is, what happens. From the very beginning, the Hungarians had difficult relations with their neighbors, who did not expect any nomads here. And this rivalry will last for more than 1,000 years. A lot of things will happen there, but it all started back then, in the 9th century. And at that moment, the Magyars in Europe felt quite lonely, because they had traveled tens of thousands of kilometers. Found themselves in a completely alien world, where they were like no one, where no one understands them at all. They were on their own. And this feeling will also stay with them for a long time. It's not for nothing that Hungarians are called the loneliest people in Europe. But do you know what else the example of the Hungarians can teach us? If you are going on a trip, think in advance where you will live, so that you do not have to compete with anyone. Because a lot depends on it. And we were more lucky than Hungarians, because today you can safely book a hotel and an apartment on Yandex. Traveling. This is a reliable, convenient service from a well-known brand. More than 28 million people use it every month. I travel a lot too. I know for sure, the place where you will live can dramatically improve your entire trip. And on Yandex, when traveling, there is a huge selection of hotels and apartments. There are profitable options for every taste from 900 to 99 rubles a day. But it's not just the price, of course. More Yandex. Travel will tell you how to spend time in a new place. There's a My Trip tab right in the app, and it's very convenient. Inside, all your confirmed bookings, past, future, as well as leisure options on the trip, and a lot of useful information from the poster. Weather and other Yandex services. It turns out a personal guide. Personally, I love this very much, but you can take this section, share it with friends who are traveling with you. And then you will not have to constantly answer endless questions, and when are we going? And where do we live? And one more important detail. Even if you are going abroad, you can pay for a hotel or apartment with a card of any Russian bank. So don't complicate your life, look for easy ways. And with this promo code, you will get a discount of up to 20%. So if you are planning a summer vacation or just going somewhere for the weekend, keep in mind that on Yandex, when traveling, finding a profitable hotel is as easy as liking this video. Book hotels and apartments for weekends and summer holidays with a discount on Yandex. Traveling. Follow the link in the description or the QR code on the screen. Time passed, and the Magyars changed a lot. Nomads on horseback turned into hard-working peasants. They settled into a new life and began to create their own country. The neighbors began to respect them, and eventually the Hungarians adopted Christianity. This is their first king, Stefan, or Istvan. And this is the crown that the Pope himself presented to him, as a recognition that you are now your own here. It is believed that it was in the 1000th year, and for Hungary this date means. That's it. No, seriously, you'll see later. Hungary is very proud of this event. If they found their homeland in the 9th century, now their homeland has become part of Christian Europe. This is a key date in the history of the country. Stefan will then be called the saint and patron saint of Hungary. Maybe you were in Budapest and took this photo. So, this basilica in the background is named after Stephen, as well as the main holiday in the country, as well as the main award, as well as many other things. But where is the crown itself now, and what does Viktor Orbán have to do with it? More on that later. So, after Hungary became a Christian kingdom, it began a golden period. The country was getting bigger, stronger, it had a strong army. Who played the second kind of cam? I say hello. Hungary, for the territory, found access to the sea. Rich deposits of silver were discovered in the country. This is the main resource at that time. Well, in general, the Hungarian kingdom has become one of the strongest in the region. And this period was the highest point in the history of the country. Because then everything will only get worse. After all, despite the fact that Hungary was part of Europe, it was still on the edge. That is, at any danger, she was the first to take the blow. It was even said about the Hungarians that they were the shield of Europe, that they are saving the Christian world. This was the case, for example, when the Mongols came here. They really devastated the country, and it was a big blow. But the real danger came later. By the 14th century, a completely new force appeared next to Hungary, which also claimed these lands. The struggle with the Ottoman Empire lasted for more than 100 years, and almost immediately it became clear that no one was going to help the Hungarians. The Holy Roman Empire, Poland, the Pope, everyone was busy with their own problems. Hungary had to fight alone. So it is not surprising that in the end Suleiman the Magnificent destroyed the entire Hungarian army in one day. The Battle of Mohacs. This is a new turn in the history of Hungary. But now with a minus sign. The kingdom ceased to exist. For the next few centuries, this territory passed from the Ottoman Empire to Austria. Other people ruled here. The lands were emptied, impoverished. The Golden Age is over, and a completely different period has begun. This time changed even Hungarian culture forever, which gradually turned into such a mix of Austrian pomposity, Turkish flavor, based on the traditions of nomads who became Christian believers. And it seems to me personally that this is one of the reasons why, for example, Budapest is such an unusual city. Or if you suddenly didn't know where the baths came from at all, and it was just a few centuries under the rule of the Ottomans. And some historians even say that this period shaped the national character of the Hungarians. There used to be a deep sense of loneliness, but now pessimism and the habit of living under constant threat have been added to it. No, of course, the Hungarians tried to fight for independence. They raised an uprising, the most famous, the Revolution of 1848 year. But Habsburg suppressed it, with the help of the Russian army, by the way. And these events, they will also be repeated in some sense. Although the Hungarians finally achieved their goal, they gained autonomy within an alien empire. And the empire itself turned from Austria into Austro-Hungary. But it was still clear who was in charge there. And it definitely wasn't Hungarians. Yes, they had their own parliament, but they didn't have their own laws, their own army, their own king. Together with them, many different peoples lived in the empire. For hundreds of years, they have been greatly mixed up inside, and have not always lived peacefully. One of these local conflicts in the Balkans will eventually develop into the First World War. And in Hungary, many hoped that this war would help them achieve their goal, to return an independent country to its former borders. But in the end, things got much worse. Formally, Hungary, as part of the empire, fought on the side of the Central Powers against the Entente. But a few days before the end of the war, a revolution took place in the country. Hungary seceded from the empire and declared independence, and it was in the former borders. For the first time after the defeat of the Ottomans, they had a real chance to become an independent state again. And maybe even return to its golden age, who knows? In any case, the new Hungarian authorities were confident that the whole world would meet them halfway. After all, the revolutionaries also fought against the Habsburgs. And the enemy is my enemy. That's it. But when the winning countries began to draw borders in Europe anew, a small problem appeared. Because just like the Hungarians, other peoples also wanted their own states: the Czechs, Slovaks, Romanians. And they have already started to fight for it by force. In other words, to return Hungary to its former borders meant that all these peoples would not receive their states. And they have already been promised them. At the same time, Hungary itself, despite the revolution inside, was still considered responsible for the First World War. Therefore, on the 4th of July, 1920, the Treaty of Trianon was signed in France. According to its terms, the lands of Great Hungary were transferred to other states: Romania, Czechoslovakia, the future Yugoslavia. The country was losing 2/3 of its territories and 60% of its population. Millions of Hungarians ended up in other states, and the new republic was forbidden to have an army, military industry. And, in addition, it had to pay reparations. Hungary was confronted with a fact. She could not refuse to accept these conditions. But Trianon became the main catastrophe in the history of the country, a symbol of humiliation and injustice. At the moment when it seemed to the Hungarians that they were about to make their country great again, it turned out that the biggest blow was waiting for them. They say that there were no winners in the First World War. But even of all the losers, Hungary suffered the most. The country tried to explain what a disaster it was. Like, if the same conditions were applied to other countries, that's what would be left of Britain, France, Italy, the United States. Trianon for Hungary. This is a national trauma. Yes, the country became independent, but it felt defeated. Hungary believed that they had been betrayed for the umpteenth time. Relations with neighbors were spoiled, and the feeling of loneliness was strengthened even more. And what will a country that has experienced such humiliation do? Of course, she will try her best to fix it. In other words, Trianon immediately began to influence the future of Hungary. First, Miklos Horthy came to power. He was an admiral, once commanded the entire fleet of the empire. But now Hungary has lost access to the sea, and Horthy was left an admiral without a fleet. In other words, it is difficult to imagine a person who would better embody this resentment. In general, Horthy was an authoritarian ruler. He talked about order, the strength of the army, the importance of religion, respect for the past. But the main thing, Horthy was a symbol of the struggle against Trianon. Under him, the main goal of foreign policy was the restoration of historical borders. In the end, it was this idea that pushed Hungary to an alliance with Hitler. Because Germany and Italy were ready to allow the Hungarians to return the territories. And at some point Hungary even started doing it. But she had to pay dearly for it. It was in Hungary that one of the most tragic and rapid episodes of the Holocaust took place. In a few months, almost 500,000 people were sent to death camps. And the Second World War ended with Hungary being occupied again. First Germany, and then the Soviet Union. Although in the elections after the war, the communists received only 17% of the votes here. But after a few years, they dealt with the opposition and controlled all the power in the country. And the new leader was a man who spent 15 years in Moscow and called himself Stalin's best student. For the Hungarians, all this was a continuation of what they had already become accustomed to for hundreds of years. It is not the first time they are not allowed to decide the fate of their country for themselves. So it was with Turkey, so it was with Austria, so it was with the Soviet Union. Maybe that's why it was in Hungary that the first large-scale uprising took place among all the countries of Eastern Europe. In the 56th, a revolution began in the country, but it was suppressed by Soviet troops. Of course, there were parallels with another revolution, which was also suppressed 100 years before. And no, it wasn't my idea. A young politician named Viktor Orbán will say this at a rally 30 years later. It was a big rally in Budapest. The authorities then agreed to solemnly reburial those who died in the revolution of the 56th. By that time, changes had already begun all over Europe, but no one knew what they would lead to. Hundreds of thousands of people came to the ceremony. It was there that the unheard-of demand was first made: withdraw Soviet troops from Hungary. This audacious phrase was also uttered from the stage by Viktor Orbán. At that moment he was 26 years old. Orbán works for the foundation of George Soros, a Hungarian-born billionaire. He went to study at Cambridge on a Soros scholarship, but at the last moment decides to return to his homeland. Together with his friends, Orbán creates a party. Alliance of Young Democrats. Fidesz. The Soros Foundation also allocated money for computers and an office for them. And people over 35 were not accepted into the party because it represented Hungarian youth who demanded changes. It was with this high-profile speech that Orbán's great political career began. At the rally, which was dedicated to the events of the past. Thanks to a speech that put pressure on one of the most painful points in the minds of Hungarians. When the authorities organized a round table with the opposition, Fidesz took an active part in these negotiations. And in the first free elections, the Young Democrats won 22 seats in parliament. They did not expect such success themselves. And certainly no one thought that this party would soon become the most successful in the history of Hungary. Orbán and his associates were such punks in the politics of the 90s. They went to the parliament session in jeans, without ties, wore beards, long hair, prepared bright speeches, and defended liberal views. All this was not at all like the period of socialism. And most importantly, none of these young people were associated with the previous regime, so Fidesz was rapidly gaining popularity. In the 98th, this party won the elections, and Viktor Orbán became prime minister. One of the youngest in the history of Hungary, he was 35 years old. The new leader of the country looked very cheerful and energetic. By the way, he adhered to a pro-Western policy. And it is even symbolic that it was under Orbán that Hungary joined NATO. But another important date fell on Orbán's first term. The millennial anniversary of Hungary. From the moment Saint Stephen received the crown from the Pope. And you and I now know that Orbán from the very beginning was able to correctly use historical dates to unite people. In honor of the anniversary, the authorities solemnly transferred that very crown to the parliament building, as a symbol of the Hungarian state, and the deputies adopted a special law, which explicitly stated that the future of the country should be based on the experience of the past. That Hungary. It is an integral part of Christian Europe, a country with a unique culture, a historical mission. That 4 centuries deterred the attack on the West and defended the Christian world. You can already feel how all these puzzles of history are beginning to come together. Although Orbán was considered a moderate politician in his first term, and his biographers say that he changed a lot after the defeat. Because, despite the cheerful speeches and fashionable hairstyles, the party of Young Democrats has not been able to fix the economy. And talk about corruption has already begun around them. Therefore, Fidesz lost the election, and Orbán went into opposition. But here he was very lucky, because without him, Hungary was waiting for an economic crisis and a giant political scandal. The parties to which Fidesz lost were even less popular, and opposition leader Orbán became the leader of the protests. At some point, the rallies turned into a clash with the police. And all this happened on the anniversary of the revolution of the 56th year. It already seems to me that in Hungary all important things should happen on some anniversaries. In general, what am I getting at? Viktor Orbán triumphantly returned to power 8 years later. But now it was a completely different politician. And the party of Young Democrats has turned into a conservative force. People who had recently been sitting in parliament in jeans were now talking about national ideas, about Christianity, about family, about Hungarian identity. Almost immediately, the new authorities adopted a new constitution, and now it literally began with the words, "We are proud." That Saint Stephen built the Hungarian state. Our people defended Europe. Our heritage, our unique language. We honor the sacred crown. A nation divided by the storms of the last century. Union of Hungarians of the past, present and future. And in this future, many of the changes that will take place in Hungary will be explained precisely by its history. For example, a very important step, under Orbán, ethnic Hungarians living abroad were able to vote in elections and receive passports. That is, the descendants of those who suffered from Trianon and lost their homeland. Now they could feel like Hungarians again. On the one hand, it was a symbolic gesture. 100 years have passed since the main tragedy in the country's history, and it was Viktor Orbán who began to correct the injustice. But it was also a competent political strategy. Fidesz generally supports pro-Hungarian forces in other countries and allocates a lot of money to diasporas abroad. For various purposes, for example, schools are built on them. And as a result, more than 90% of voters abroad are now voting for the Fidesz party. Trianon appears again and again in Hungarian politics. There are many monuments all over the country in honor of this defeats. And there is now a bust of Mikla Shorty in the parliament building. The main symbol of the fight against injustice. Orbán calls him an outstanding politician, although many note that Horthy was actually associated with the Holocaust and was an ally of Hitler. Orbán sometimes behaves as if the current borders of Hungary do not exist in principle. He regularly travels to these regions that were once in Hungary. For example, to Transylvania. And it was there that he spoke directly about what kind of regime he was building in Hungary. Among other things, Orbán is called strongman for these words. Something in between a tough leader and an authoritarian leader. For example, an important part of his strategy is the fight against the world elite, which wants to subjugate Hungary. Orbán launched an active campaign of George Soros, on whose money the Fidesz party was founded, turned into one of the main internal enemies, and his foundation, where Orbán once worked, was forced to move to Germany. The Hungarian leader criticizes the European Union. Their first big conflict began in 2015 during the refugee crisis. Hungary strongly opposed migrants and literally did not let them into the country. And Orbán compared the refugees to the Ottomans who came here in the 19th century. He called them a threat to Christianity and traditional values. Does this prevent him from being friends with Erdogan? No, it doesn't bother. But Orbán constantly disagrees with the West and blocks many key decisions. And here it is logical to ask. But how so? After all, Hungary constantly calls itself part of Europe. Yes, just another Europe that Viktor Orbán wants to build himself. He is not going to leave the European Union, he wants to change it from the inside. And all this is happening at a time when the EU is obviously in crisis. Therefore, Orbán's ideas about what Europe should look like attract many. It's not just that he and his party have won every election since 2000. Yes, there was pressure on the media, the opposition, and payments to state employees. But Hungary also holds the most conservative positions in Europe according to all polls. Many people there like the idea of a strong state, independent of the big powers, which is based on religion, on family, on national identity. But if you know everything that has happened to Hungary over the last 1,000 years, it becomes clear that these views appeared for a reason. They were formed, among other things, because of the difficult and complex history of the country. This is the result of thousands of years of defeats, from which Hungary is still trying to recover.